This is a reading and annotation of my essay, AI Has Intelligence, It Doesn't Have Intellect. Why confusing the two underscores the importance of vernacular academia. There's a difference between intelligence and intellect. And understanding this distinction will radically change how we prepare for the future of work and education in the age of AI. If you normally skim my posts, this one is very nuanced. So I recommend that you take your time with it. Feel free to print this one out, highlight, annotate, etc. Here is my first annotation. I knew when I was writing this essay how controversial it would be. And I named some of the, assumptions I knew people were going to make about the distinction I put forward in this essay. But I think I'm just like a bit overwhelmed by just a lot of people were very um predisposed to their understanding of what intelligence and intellect is. And that's why, despite the warning that I gave early, that's why I said, look, you got to take your time with this one. You got to engage with the text. You have to be willing to follow the argument all the way through. Because once you understand how I'm defining intelligence and how I'm defining intellect, then it will become clearer why the title of the essay is the title of the essay. Let's continue. I've been rereading Anti Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter. This book was written in the 1960s, yet its diagnosis is as relevant today as it was back then. In particular, I want us to take a look at a few sections from Chapter 2 entitled On the Unpopularity of Intellect. Hofstadter, a former history professor at Columbia University, rightfully noted that we often assume and maybe even inherently know there's a difference between intellect and intelligence, but we rarely articulate it well enough to define them both. He defines intelligence as, quote, an excellence of mind that is employed within a fairly narrow, immediate, and predictable range. It is a manipulative, adjustive, unfailing practical quality, one of the most eminent and endearing of the animal virtues. Intelligence works within the framework of limited but clearly stated goals and may be quick to shear away questions of thought that do not seem to help in reaching them. That's from page 35. This idea of intelligence as narrow and goal oriented is what makes it applicable to humans, animals, and machines alike. An ape can be intelligent, albeit in its own way, as well as a goldfish. Intelligence is measured by the ability to pursue and complete certain tasks, and then measuring that against certain benchmarks. Let's pause for annotation. So, when I was writing the specific paragraph, I was thinking of the book God, Human, Animal, Machine, Technology, Metaphor, and the Search for Meaning, which is a book by Megan O. Giebelin. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. This book lives rent free in my mind. I think part of it is it really shows like the similarities that we have between all of the four that were mentioned, but also what makes us so humanly unique and so distinct from those other things. And I think oftentimes when we talk about this very narrow definition of intelligence, which obviously not everyone will agree upon, that's why I really wanted to lean heavy on Hofstadter's articulation of what intelligence is. Not everyone's going to agree with that, but I think it gives us at least a working definition that we can use for the rest of this essay. And let's get into the controversial bit. Within the AI industry, defining intelligence is a hotly debated topic. Often, I believe, because people use intelligence as a measure for or stepping stone towards consciousness and therefore personhood in the legal sense of the term, meaning do AI systems deserve certain rights and liberties if deemed to be conscious like humans and animals? Pause for annotation. Now, obviously, there's a range of people who follow me from frontier lab researchers to AI vegans, right? And I've been at academic conferences, AI conferences, where people are literally ready to throw chairs over the question of whether or not AI is conscious. And mind you, I'm very picky about my words. I didn't say AI is conscious. I didn't say AI has rights. I didn't say AI has personhood in the legal sense, like how a company has legal personhood, which actually there's a really good book on this. I'm so sorry, give me one second. I believe it's called We the Corporations that talks about the legal personhood. Yep, by Adam Winkler. Great book. But yeah, basically how a company can be deemed a legal person. But yeah, I think that's where a lot of the controversy actually, stood when I was sharing the essay online because, once again, despite the warning, like, hey, you gotta really read through this one. I know that's what people think about when they hear any claim that AI is intelligent, but hey, that's why I linked to that paper, just to acknowledge that literature without having to, go into defense mode. Because that's the thing about essay writing. There are some essays that are on the defensive, right? But then, you really want to. I don't want to speak for everyone, but at least for me, when you're trying to think through a theory, it's really important to lay a stake to your own theory first. Not constantly playing the defense, but saying, hey, this is how I'm putting forward this idea and, allow for conversation to come out of it. Okay, let's continue. I point this out because we've all seen AI systems excel at really narrow and specific tasks like launching sophisticated supply chain attacks against major tech companies, causing huge data breaches. Very big story. You should read that one. Even in less dire circumstances, you might have given your AI agent a specific task or goal, like finding a pattern or inaccuracy in a complex data set, and it executed on it flawlessly. In the same way, you can give a student a specific goal task and then measure how well they complete that task. Hofstadter would say you are measuring intelligence. This is what many contemporary educational systems have sought to do. Yet, intelligence is not under attack per se. Generally speaking, the focus isn't purely on a narrowly defined scope of a project being completed. The problem is intellect. Hofstadter defines intellect as, quote, the critical, creative, and contemplative side of mind. I added that emphasis. Whereas intelligence seeks to grasp, manipulate, reorder, adjust. Intellect examines, ponders, wanders, theorizes, criticizes, imagines. Intelligence will seize the immediate meaning in a situation and evaluate it. Intellect evaluates evaluations and looks for the meanings of situations as a whole. Intelligence can be praised as a quality in animals. Intellect being a unique manifestation of human dignity is both praised and assailed as a quality in men. That's also from page 35. I also added the emphasis on human dignity. My undergraduate thesis was actually on human dignity, and I wanted to write, almost like a whole 17 different essays. And then I had to like stop myself so that we could focus on the main essay. But I'm looking back at my notes and I'm like, wow, I really got into the human dignity part. But part of the reason why I added the bolded part, if you're reading the essay with me as I'm, giving you this annotation, was almost sort of like a reminder to myself, like, I have a lot to write about in terms of theories of human dignity and things of that sort. So, random note. Let's continue. Building off of this definition, intellect is an uncontained roaming of the mind. It doesn't care for specific goals, but seeks independent thought. Intellect is a distinctly human quality. Therefore, the pursuit of the life of the mind, those you Chicago kids are always going on about, is a uniquely human one. So, why is this potentially dangerous? A cultivated intellect cannot be easily controlled because it is not confined to specific end goals. A person with intellect can surprise you, take detours, and transcend any narrowly defined skill set. This is why I believe the aim of education should be the cultivation of intellect, not just intelligence. Hofstadter makes this distinction worthwhile when he concludes, quote, when the difference is so defined, it becomes easier to understand why we sometimes say that a mind of admittedly penetrating intelligence is relatively unintellectual, and why, by the same token, we see among minds that are unmistakably intellectual a considerable range of intelligence. Also from page 35. So you can have someone who is intelligent enough to meet the stated goals for a decree, and this person can still be unintellectual. This becomes even more nuanced when we talk about anti intellectualism. I would argue you can be incredibly intelligent, showing a depth of narrow yet deep understanding on a topic, and still be anti intellectual. In fact, one of the key orchestrators of anti intellectualism in the United States today has a PhD in American history. Pause for annotation. I love this delicate balance that Hofstadter is placing between intellect and intelligence. And once again, I really encourage you to go into chapter 2 and eventually if I end up teaching this text, which I would love to as a seminar, because I mean it's just so rich. There's so much to dissect and to debate and to have, substantive conversations over. But I really encourage you to read all of chapter 2 because, he talks more about the role of the intellectual and, other misconceptions and how, ways of hating intellectualism and those who possess intellect manifests itself throughout history. So it's very important. But, um, there's a part in the text in which he talks about people who are non-intellectual and people who are unintellectual, because I think sometimes it can be very easy to go into pure dichotomies. Obviously, intellectualism and anti-intellectualism is a dichotomy as set up. But sorry if I'm blabbing a little bit. See, like this is why you guys sometimes complain when I do things unscripted. But the idea of being unintellectual, I would argue, um, is different from being anti-intellectual, as we'll see with the Project 2025 foray that I've been deep diving into for this essay. Also, yeah, sorry, I tried to see if I could find a public link for his dissertation. Literally could not. I had to access it through my university account. I think there was a public link, but it was just so unstable, and I was like, okay, this like you got his PhD, I believe, at UT Austin. So I look, there's a lot going on in Texas, and don't get me started over there. But um, yeah, so sorry, you guys, that there's no public link for his dissertation. All right, let's continue. On the anti intellectualism of Project 2025, Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation and the mastermind behind Project 2025, wrote his doctoral dissertation on how enslaved people in Louisiana employed a variety of tools, spiritual, economic, and political, to challenge and subvert their masters. He found that despite the horrific conditions of slavery, they were still able to, in his words, exploit, quote, that knowledge to create traditions that were distinctly their own, end quote. That's from page 16 of his doctoral dissertation. In other words, he studied how an oppressed and dispossessed people could conjure up their own distinct ways of knowing and navigate a world that didn't even see them as human before God, man, or the law. This is exemplary of what Hofstadter meant when he said, quote, we know, for instance, that all academic men are not intellectuals. We often lament this fact. We know that there is something about intellect, as opposed to professionally trained intelligence, which does not adhere to whole vocations, but only to persons. And when we are troubled about the position of intellect and the intellectual class in our society, it is not only the status of certain vocational groups which we have in mind, but the value attached to a certain mental quality, page 36. Now, I want to be clear. The whole point of Hofstadter's award winning book is to expose the sowing of fear of intellectuals in American society. I'm not saying every academic has an anti intellectual agenda. Of course not. I'm saying don't equate intelligence with intellect or even with virtue while we're at it. It's a nuanced argument, and I can't fully do it justice in one post. But I want you to read chapter 2 from Anti Intellectualism in American Life to get a fuller picture. So, how does this distinction help us understand the future of education and work? Well, the Department of Education in the US is being ripped to shreds, just as intended in Project 2025. Kevin Roberts said in his book, Taking Back Washington to Save America, which, according to the New Statesman, was originally entitled Dawn's Early Light Burning Down Washington to Save America, although the UK version still has this title. Institutions like the Department of Education must be, quote, defanged, defunded, and destroyed for the good of the overall ecosystem, end quote. Similarly, he states, quote, for America to flourish again, they don't need to be reformed. They need to be burned, end quote. I'm aware I'm focusing a lot on the US, as that's where I lived for the majority of my life. But many of these tactics are being replicated around the world, so it's important to pay attention. Pause for annotation. Okay, so obviously, people from over 95 countries read my Substack. So a lot of the analysis is very US centric, but just some examples because I started listing some of the examples from all around the world, and then just the essay just starts to get clogged. And I was like, look, I already know I'm going to struggle to hold people's attention after trying to go into the nuances of anti-intellectualism in American life. So I said, like, let me cut it. But I'm thinking about what's happening in Hungary. I'm thinking about what's happening here in the UK and how the far right is attempting to influence, or in some cases, they are actually being successful, influence UK elections and public opinion. I just want you guys to know that there's a huge track record of how anti-intellectualism is spreading all around the world. So I don't want you to take that as a US only argument that I'm making here. Okay, let's continue. As institutions of higher learning face increasing defunding, constraints, and hostility to the teaching of certain subjects, we must not limit the development of intellect to legacy institutions. Once again, this is a delicate argument I'm making, so please don't read what I am not saying. I'm not saying institutions of higher learning should become obsolete. I'm saying, regardless of whether or not someone chooses to attend college in the future, or if Roberts and the anti-intellectuals succeed in the dismantling of institutions of higher learning, we need to prepare for the cultivation of intellect and critical thinking beyond these formal institutions. College shouldn't be the only, emphasis on only, place where intellect and critical thinking are acquired. Just look around at your elders, friends, and community leaders who cultivate their intellect without formal higher learning. Pause for annotation. Now, I think, I often say, and this is a separate essay I'm working on, that as we prepare for the uncertain future that we are all collectively entering into, we have to accept the fact that certain things will no longer be given. I think we've become so accustomed to a specific way of life, and a lot of our institutions, though durable and though reliable, are for many reasons beyond just AI and the global crisis and all these other things, are no longer as durable, right? So I think it's almost like I don't like using this word, but it's almost like a survival strategy to say, like, hey, despite what might be happening across different institutions, how can we cultivate this imperative to keep the cultivation of intellect going, regardless of what's happening? right? Like that's the argument that I'm making, that, people should have multiple different options so that if something does happen to these avenues that we've come to rely on, we're still cultivating in our homes, in our jobs, in new institutions, whatever it may be. So I just want to, articulate the heart posture behind that, because I think sometimes whenever I do critique higher education and its current mode of existence, there could be like, oh my gosh, you don't want it to exist. It's like, beloved, look, I'm in the middle of getting my PhD. I've seen the depths and insides of higher education. And because I'm so close to the problem, that's why I try to give these critiques. Let's continue. Coded language prior to AI. This is why I believe in the power of vernacular academia. Before I define it, let me give you a bit of a background. I'm the child of Nigerian immigrants who got tested for being, quote, gifted and talented at a young age. And once discovered I had it, got bussed out to PWIs, predominantly white institutions. At these institutions, I learned the art of code switching, speaking at different registers to make myself seem worthy of this narrowly defined subjective label of being gifted. By the time I got to high school, I perfected the art of code switching, turning off my Baltimore accent and Nigerianisms the second I got to the parking lot of my PW high school. One day, after reading a poem I submitted on code switching, my creative writing teacher introduced me to Def Jam poetry. I went home and spent hours dissecting the rhyme and reason of every poet that stepped on the stage. Many of you all may have been introduced to Saul Williams because of his role in the blockbuster Ryan Coogler film Sinners, but my first time seeing him was when he unrolled a piece of paper as long as a CVS receipt to perform his poem Coded Language. I encourage you to watch it here. Content warning for profanity. Okay, pause for annotation. So the reason why I gave the background before going into Saul Williams' amazing, 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 amazing um, poem is because I want people to understand that while I offer theory, and this goes back to the idea of operating at different registers, while I offer theory, it's also rooted um, by my personal experience. I'm human at the end of the day. I've lived life. And, once again, a lot of these critiques and theories I'm putting forward is because of the way I see the world. It's from my unique perspective. Right. And also, if my creative writing teacher, if you are listening to this, shout out to you. Send me an email, comment, something like, man, thank you for introducing me to beauty, 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 beauty of spoken word. It's changed how I am as a communicator, how I, navigate and move throughout the world. So just thank you for that. Um, let's continue. So I include a quote from the spoken word poem in the essay. We conflate the unknown, unseen with pure ignorance when becoming aware of the depth of what one does not know is essential to living the life of the mind. On vernacular academia. Growing up, I felt like society tended to equate intelligence with certain linguistic proclivities. So, if I enunciated and slowed down my pace, I could be better understood and accepted as an intellectual, a person dedicated to living the life of the mind. That feeling amplified ever more when I started my doctorate, careful to adopt academic needs so I could be understood. But that's the thing about code switching. It is quite cognitively taxing, especially for racial minorities, in part because you can't please everybody. No matter the register, you'll always have dissenters. Pause for annotation. I reworked that whole section multiple times and I just, rereading out loud again, I'm like, oh my gosh, that landed the way I wanted to because the study I linked to, I started to go a little bit more in depth with some of the findings. And then once again, I know I gave you guys a lot of information here. So that's why I was like, let me just cut that part. So yeah, that's a weird short paragraph. Hey, it's already out there. See, look, now I'm going into editor mode. But yeah, essentially just want to give you my thoughts on that. Highly recommend that study, by the way. Especially if this is your first time like caring about code switching. All right, let's continue. So, this brings me back to vernacular academia. Let's first talk about how it's different from academic vernacular. Notice the nuance. This is the insider gatekeeping, jargon filled language used in the ivory tower that has become the acceptable register of communication for professional development and success. Not all jargon is bad, by the way. I think it's worth expanding one's vocabulary. Like when I learned about algorithmic agnotology, um, it must be properly defined. Please watch that video on algorithmic ethnology by Dr. Alondra Nelson. I'm going to make sure everyone knows that term by the end of the year. Let's continue. Vernacular academia, on the other hand, is a kind of scholarship that can operate on a register familiar to the speaker and or the metaphorical streets or whatever your term for community or grassroots engagement without sacrificing the rigor and complexity of the topics themselves. A working definition here, but I'm attempting to define something that's not new. We see the vernacular academia of bell hooks, Dr. Jamila Lescott, let me know if I mispronounced that, and Gloria Anzaladua, correct me if I'm wrong, all around us. For example, as anti intellectual agendas continue to spread around the world, we must ask ourselves how we will continue to cultivate not just intelligence, but intellect, a distinctly human quality at work, school, and at home. I leave you with Saul Williams' mid poem provocation. Not going to say that word so we don't get censored. Better realize now is the time to self actualize. Thank you so much for listening to my annotation of this essay. It's a privilege to write this newsletter for you all. And yeah, until next time.